We are all on a journey. Hey, I am Chuck the bureaucrat, and I want to tell you a little secret. I got promoted to colonel because of a fluke in the Army's manpower strategy. And while most people don't like to talk about this, in fact, a lot of them don't even realize it's happening, major aspects of your career, they're influenced by large strategic events that are way beyond your control. For people who can read the writing on the wall, these factors are clear indicators on whether you should hang with the military or cash in your chips and go someplace else. To my mind, there are three factors that really drive this process: the Army's active duty end strength, casualty statistics, and the DoD budget. Additionally, shifts in these factors tend to be influenced by what I think of as milestone events, major geopolitical events that trigger changes in either the end strength or the casualties or the funding. Roughly speaking, the milestone events over the last 40 years have been the fall of the Berlin Wall, Desert Shield, Desert Storm, 9/11, the Iraq invasion, the Iraq troop surge and withdraw, the Afghanistan withdrawal, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, you might wonder why I go all the way back to the 1980s, and there's actually two reasons. First, I want to show you how these patterns have played out in the past. Policymakers, bureaucrats, are crafting policies that affect the future, your future, by looking back at these historical events. So it's not a bad idea for you to understand those same patterns. Second, even though most service members on active duty today joined sometime after 9/11, there are some important senior leaders who date all the way back to the early 80s. The chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, he was commissioned in 1980. The sergeant major enlisted in 1987. And those crusty CW5s and 4s, they were around for the 80s. Me, I got commissioned back in 1995. All of us old dudes are survivors of that long history, and it's important to understand that any advice we give is based on the experiences we had going through those events. So before I show you how this impacts your military experience and your career, I want to walk you through what I think of as the 9 phases we've experienced in the last 40 years. From 1980 to 1986, we saw the Reagan-era military buildup. This was marked by an increase in military spending. There was a large and growing active duty force, and with the exception of the Grenada invasion in 1983, almost zero combat casualties. For a lot of old soldiers, these are the good old days. A lot of cash to spend on training, lots of new equipment, and the biggest concern about combat was that you'd miss your chance to see the elephant. As Reagan enters his second term, spending starts to cool a little bit. The end strength starts to come down, and there's a few instances of hostilities. The Libyan bombing, a missile attack in the Persian Gulf, and the Panama invasion. And during this gray period, there's a number of seismic events that happen. In 1989, the Berlin Wall comes down, and by 1991, the Soviet Union has dissolved. And the first Gulf War, Desert Shield and Desert Storm, it happens about the same time. All of this brings us to the Red Period. With no Cold War enemy, the need for lots of troops and lots of spending, it starts to fade. Plus, notice how brief and low casualty Desert Storm was. There was a lot more use of the Army Reserve and the National Guard in this conflict than there had been in previous ones. The big takeaway that policymakers had from all of that was that they really didn't need the regular army to be as big as it had been. So in this phase is the biggest reduction in force that we have seen since the end of the Vietnam War. This decline was so fast that it really affected the Army's culture. Good, quality officers and NCOs were involuntarily separated from the Army. A zero-tolerance mentality started to set in because the slightest black mark on a leader's file, well, that was the end of their career. Declining resources ate away at training opportunities. And While low to no casualties may seem like a good thing, it also created a crisis of purpose. Imagine the feelings of someone who went to Desert Storm as a major, but then they spent the last half of their career in a place where it was a shrinking force, shrinking resources, and no real mission. Then on 9/11, everything changes as we enter the blue phase. It is a strange and short period of time. Volunteerism is high, the force grows, recruiting is easy, money starts to flow in, and there are still not that many casualties. So even though it was a time of real uncertainty, it was also an optimistic time. And then the party ends. The green phase is marked by a sharp increase in casualties, and that leads to the completely rational struggle to convince people to join the military. That's why the end strength wobbles like it does. This was not a fun time to be in the Army, and it was not going to get better anytime soon. In 2007, the Iraq surge begins the yellow phase. The Army crams something like 20,000 extra soldiers into Iraq to try to put a lid on all the violence. It works to an extent, but the thing that really brings the casualties down is simply withdrawing from Iraq. During the purple phase, we still have soldiers in Afghanistan, but the Obama administration is trying to bring down end strength and military spending. Trump tries to reverse these patterns, and I swear to God, I did not intentionally pick orange for this phase. But then again, I didn't change it after I noticed. Anyways, with 6 or 7 years of low casualties behind us, Biden comes in and orders the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. That comes along with the expected reductions in end strength and spending. And then Russia invades Ukraine. And look, I don't know what lies to the right of this chart, but hopefully by understanding how these patterns play out, you can better understand what is going on around you as you experience your career. To see how this can help you understand your career, I'm going to start by using my career as an example. And then we can talk about all those other people that you're going to meet while you're in the Army. And we'll wrap up with some possibilities for your own future. Okay, back to me. I joined ROTC in 1991 and was commissioned in 1995. It should not surprise you that 1995 had the lowest number of ROTC cadets commissioned of any year in the past 40 years. In the early 90s, getting an ROTC scholarship was hard, and even good cadets couldn't get assigned to active duty. So that relatively small cohort of second lieutenants joined the Army. And guess what they ran into face first? Captains and lieutenant colonels who had just survived a vicious reduction in force. Not the best command climates, not much money to do anything cool, and, oh, by the way, not much of an obvious future. We got out in boatloads. A remarkable number of my peers resigned their commissions, and that tiny pool of officers in my year group got smaller and smaller. Then 9/11 happens, and by this point, I had already started drilling as a reservist. But plenty of my cohort had a funny little problem. The standard contract at the time was 4 years on active duty, 4 years in the reserves. And so they couldn't leave the reserves. They just had to kind of sit around and wait to see what the Army was going to do. Then in 2004, I got orders mobilizing me to Fort Dix. Now, just between you and me, I could have failed to report. My 8 years were done. I worked for an old Vietnam-era draftee, and he advised me to go. In 2005, my orders got extended, and it started to become clear that if I stayed in the Army Reserve, I was just going to get mobilized over and over again. So, in for a penny, in for a pound, I joined the Active Guard and Reserve program within the Army Reserve, served 2005, and then 6, and then 7. Now, look what was happening to my cohort during that time. Plenty of them said no thank you and didn't even show up. Plenty more got overused and finally bailed. 15 years in, and our little year group has seen brutal attrition. 2010 is grim, but 2012 we start making lieutenant colonel. It's not what you would call a competitive board. And don't even get me started about the force structure changes that were going on that showed that we required additional field grade officers. And by this point, things had started to slow down. The usual people who dropped their paperwork at 20 years, they left in 2015. So there I was in 2016, smallest cohort of lieutenants ever. Always a shrinking pool. And all of a sudden, kind of mediocre cadet, well, he's competitive for colonel. In fact, one of the reasons I stayed on active duty until 2023 was simply to wait for enough people to get promoted to replace me. By the way, I am very proud of you guys and hugely grateful. Okay, that's my story, but these phases of the last 40 years, they have shaped every sergeant major, lieutenant colonel, buck sergeant, warrant officer that you are ever going to meet. This history has made them who they are. A lot of the master sergeants you're going to meet, they signed up in that blue phase. And then they came of age as specialists and junior NCOs in those crucible years. These folks do not view the last 5 to 7 years as the real Army. And they have a sense of obligation that they have to prepare young soldiers and officers for the next time something real happens. And that's happening even as some of those younger folks don't see how serious things can get. Consider a captain who joined about, 2016. To him, a military career is apt to look a lot less dangerous. He probably sees a lot of administrative things that have just kind of been neglected over the years, and to him, some of the ups and downs probably feel more political than anything else. And here's something else to keep in mind when you're thinking about officers, especially West Pointers. In most cases, they committed to join the military 4 years before they actually got commissioned. In a lot of cases, they volunteered for a set of conditions which were entirely different than what they got commissioned into. So as you interact with these people, understand the times that they lived through and how that shapes what they're trying to communicate to you. The old dudes might have had experiences that look nothing like what you're experiencing, but trust me, they are highly motivated to communicate those lessons learned. Take what you can from them and get ready. And now, for the most important part, you. Like I said, I don't know the missions or the dates that lie ahead for you, but I'm fairly certain if you stay around for the long haul, you're going to experience 2 very distinctly different messages. At some point, they are going to use you like a rented mule. It's going to suck, and they are going to put controls in place so that you can't squirm away. And number 2, at some point, they are very strongly going to communicate that they don't need you. They will make it very easy and attractive to leave. The order in which your cohort experiences these 2 messages is going to do a lot to shape how you perceive your military experience. For my cohort, we got the "we don't need you" message in the first half of our career and the "we can't live without you" message in the second half. Personally, I think that's better than somebody who came in like 2004 and got those 2 messages in the reverse order. It seems kind of crappy to me that the second half of your career might have that "we don't need you" feeling. Wouldn't surprise me if those folks ended up feeling kind of cynical. If you're new to the Army today, I bet that you're not exactly feeling like they need you, but they do. Or maybe more accurately, they will. And the soldiers you're going to lead are going to need you too. And they will need you to have absorbed the lessons from all those old soldiers. So get ready and watch this video to see why I think the warrior ethos is more important when you're not in combat than when you are.